So I wanted to continue today's lecture, or continue our lectures, series of lectures on Paul, with a little bit of discussion about the epistles himself, and then what we can learn about the man from the historical portrait that emerges from reading different documents in the New Testament. First off, let's talk about the classifications of Paul's letters. Scholars typically talk about the difference between Paul's authentic letters and then what I like to call the Deutero-Pauline letters. And Deutero means secondary in Greek. So they're Pauline. They have maybe some connection to Paul, but they're Deutero. And we'll talk more about what that means here in a second. But what typically scholars regard as the Pauline letters, the authentic Pauline letters, are 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, Philippians, Philemon, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Romans. Basically, the majority of scholars can agree that Paul's hand, or Paul, maybe not his hand, but Paul had a very much to do with writing these letters, right? That he really, we could consider these authorship by Paul. The letters that are in the tradition of Paul, and so are often called the Deutero-Paulines, are Colossians, Ephesians, 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, and Titus. These are Deutero. Sometimes these are called pseudo-Paulines because they're false. They're thought to be not written by Paul. I like to think of them as Deutero-Paulines because they're in the Pauline tradition. What does all this mean, and how do we discover what this means, and what kinds of differences can we make? Now, one of the things that Ehrman talks about is pseudonymity and pseudepigrapha, and he actually goes a little bit further than I really am comfortable in going. He almost goes to say that there was some kind of falsifying or deceit in writing the Deutero-Pauline letters, right? He calls them forgeries, and I'm just not comfortable with that kind of language. Let me talk about how scholars do the work to distinguish between the Pauline letters and the Deutero-Pauline, or the authentic Pauline letters and the Deutero-Pauline letters. Let's talk about these two big words that I just used. Pseudonymity. Pseudo means false naming, and pseudepigrapha means false writing. And these are two terms associated with texts of the ancient world. Pseudonymity is the process by which you put a name on a document that asserts authorship that really is not the author of the document. And folks did this in the ancient world. And pseudepigrapha are the body of works, technically. The Old Testament pseudepigrapha are a body of works written in the style of Old or New Testament that are attributed to someone that are not necessarily written by them. Now, a lot of these are sort of odd, apocryphal, apocalyptic works, like the books of Enoch. Well, we know that Enoch did not write the books of Enoch. It was probably written by someone during Second Temple Judaism who wrote this document of the end of times. But he puts Enoch as the author because, well, Enoch was taken up by God and disappeared into the heavens. Well, how convenient, right? So Enoch was in heaven, was able to see what was going to happen in the future, and apparently wrote these letters and dropped them, back to earth. And so you can have the books of Enoch. A lot of these are just sort of strange apocalyptic works that are the pseudepigrapha. But pseudonymity we do find in the New Testament. A lot of times we just don't know who wrote these texts. We have the tradition of the church, which I think we can trust, but a lot of times, or to a degree that we can trust, but a lot of times, we really don't know. how do we know? How do we distinguish between Paul's authentic letters and Paul's Deutero-Pauline letters? What do we do in order to distinguish between these texts? Well, I guess one of the things, if we look at the Pauline letters, you know, one of the things that we can agree upon is that they have a similar style. So 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, Philippians, Philemon, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Romans, they all really have a certain style to them. They have a certain way of writing to them that is distinctive, right? So Paul's writing with a certain style. And you all know authors write with certain words, prefer certain ways of communicating. They have certain structures. And when we find variance from this, when we find that there are differences from the style that we're used to, that is probably evidence that we've got another author at work. So one of the things that scholars look for in letters are what are called hapax legomena. And that's a very, very fancy word for a word that occurs only once in a corpus of writings. So a word that occurs only once in the New Testament is called a hapax legomena. If you've got a word like that, if you've got a whole bunch of words in a letter that occur only once in the New Testament, well, that's evidence that you've got a different writer with a different vocabulary, a different style. And you can line these up. You can line these Deutero-Paulines up, and you can see that they have a preponderance of hapax legomena. They have a preponderance of stylistic and vocabulary issues that set them apart, that really make them different than the commonly agreed upon authentic Pauline letters. And then there's theological concerns. Paul's position on women in his authentic letters, in Romans and 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, Philippians, Philemon, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, seems to be reversed by Colossians and Ephesians. Paul, in his early letters anyway, seems to have a very egalitarian understanding of how men and women are supposed to work together and live together. When you get to these Deutero-Paulines, which I think are probably later, there's probably an issue that they're not addressing. Does that mean Paul didn't write Colossians and Ephesians? Well, did Paul write any of his letters? You know, that's something to consider. Paul, writing in the ancient world was not the way that we write. Scribes could write. Scribes would write. Only maybe 15% of the population could read. Writing was the work of a lower status person. Folks in the ancient world dictated. Scholars in the ancient world dictated their letters. And there's clear evidence that Paul seems to be dictating his letters. We have a scribe who is noted in Romans. In Galatians, Paul signs the letter and says, "See with what big letters I write my own name." Well, if Paul was writing with such big letters, it's probably indication that he didn't write much. He could write, right? Obviously, if you could read, you could write. But he didn't write much. A scribe would write, you know, with very fine, small letters on a document. But Paul probably dictated the letter and had it read back to him and changed it and edited it and did all the authorship. Here's what I think is going on with Colossians and Ephesians, and probably, you know, some of the other letters, maybe 2nd Thessalonians. I think these are clearly, Colossians and Ephesians are part of what we call the captivity letters. Paul's in prison when he's writing these. My hunch is Paul is in Colossians, well, in all of his letters, we see that there's evidence. For example, in 1 Thessalonians, he's writing with Timothy and Silas. In all of his letters, Paul seems to be has a community who's helping him write his letters. I believe that Paul trained his disciples to work with him as he was writing his letters. And by the time he's in prison and he's in his advanced age, he trusts them well enough to be able to dictate portions of the letter and then take the letter and write the rest, right? So you can imagine Paul might have dictated portions of Colossians from prison with his scribe and then trusted his scribe well enough to say, go ahead and fill the rest in. Remember that conversation we had a couple weeks ago about this, or a conversation about that? Put some of that in, right? Think about this. Do you think the Pope writes everything that is attributed to him? Do you think most sort of high-level bosses or others write everything that is attributed to them? No, do you think Donald Trump actually wrote the books? We know he did not write the books that are attributed to him. He had shadow authors. He had people who actually wrote them for him. He dictated portions. He was interviewed for portions, right? But he didn't really write them. That's true with Paul. I think probably by the time, I think he really, dictated probably word for word his authentic letters. By the time you get into Colossians, he has a group of folks that he trusts well enough, his disciples, who can write for him in his name. Ephesians is basically a knockoff Colossians. It's very similar to it. So Paul probably was able to tell, the author of Ephesians to say, I'll take a little bit of Colossians and add this and add that and restructure it a little bit and bring it back to me, right? 2 Thessalonians is very similar to 1 Thessalonians. I think it's a similar kind of deal where the author had a copy of 1 Thessalonians and probably Paul says, well, model it after this and work it this way and work it that way, right? So he still has a fairly heavy hand in Colossians and Ephesians and 2 Thessalonians, but he's probably not himself dictating these things. I think by the time you get to 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, which are also written in Paul's name, his scribes, maybe Paul is off the scene by this time, maybe he's passed away by this time, but his disciples, they don't want to necessarily, they want to honor the man, right? I don't think there's anything falsifying going on here. I really disagree with Ehrman here that this is some kind of forgery or whatever, that they're doing this for profit or attention. I really don't agree with that. I think these are Paul's disciples who are trying to be true to who Paul was. And they're not necessarily wanting to write in their own name because they still represent Paul's school. They still represent Paul, right? And so they write these documents. Now, clearly the theology of 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus is much different than, say, the theology of 1 Thessalonians. It's still Pauline, though. It's still in the school of Paul. It's just developed, or in some cases you might say devolved in certain ways. Now, who was this Paul? Oh, before we get to that, let me just talk about a few other classifications. You have pastoral epistles. These are letters written only to one individual, as a pastor would write an individual. So 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus. You have these so-called Catholic epistles. Now, Catholic not in the sense of Roman Catholic, but Catholic in the sense of the Greek word katholos, which means everywhere. These are sort of letters written to larger communities. James, 1st and 2nd Peter, Jude, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. These are written to the church everywhere from these individuals. So unlike the Pauline letters, which are written directly to communities or individuals, the Catholic epistles are written to everywhere. We have a set of Pauline letters that are written from captivity where Paul was in prison, so Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, and Philemon. Now remember, I think Philippians and Philemon are clearly authentically Pauline, but Ephesians and Colossians, I think Paul's still around. He's just sort of more dictating or just telling a scribe what to put in there. And then the so-called Johannine epistles. Remember we talked about the Johannine school as a group of folks who wrote the Gospel of John. Well, this same group also produced these little letters, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. Okay, now going on to Paul. Okay. when we try to reconstruct Paul historically, we have two main sources. One is Acts, and the other are the direct sources that we have from Paul's letters himself. When scholars are trying to put together a life of Paul, it's better to prefer Paul's direct sources about himself than Acts, which is a secondary source. Right? Acts, the author of Acts, Luke, was trying to put together everything from sources that he had. So where there are differences between what Paul himself says and what Acts says about Paul, well, yeah, obviously, you want to follow Paul. Only problem is, Acts gives us a lot of biographical detail about what Paul did. Paul doesn't talk about that stuff in his letters. Not as much, anyway. So we have a whole bunch of stuff about Paul's life that we don't have in the letters of Acts. And there are times when Acts, in its detail, especially in its theology or portrayal of Paul's theology, seem to contradict Paul. And it makes me wonder whether the author of Acts actually had a copy of Paul's actual letters or was just documenting Paul's life based upon sources, people that he'd interviewed. And I think it's probably the latter. So we don't have access to the letters that Paul, all the letters that Paul wrote in Acts, and Paul's theology is a little bit different. Now, it could be that what Paul taught communities in public was a little bit different than what he wrote, and so that might account for some of the differences, right? But we have a struggle reconciling the primary sources, Paul's letters, which just don't give us enough to reconstruct a life of Paul, with Acts. So scholars generally try to use a little bit of both to put a life together for Paul. There are some important dates that I think we should keep mind of when we're talking about Paul. And some of those dates relate to the lives of different kings and people who were living at a various time. The important dates are the Claudius Edict and the Gallio inscription. The Claudius Edict, which we find out about in Suetonius, talks about a period of time in which Jews were expelled from Rome, around 49. Long story, but it has to do with some uprisings in the Jewish community, probably related to who believed in Jesus and who didn't. Now, some of those Jews who were kicked out of Rome due to the Claudius Edict are mentioned in Acts 18, and Paul is mentioned in the same passage as meeting these Jews. Prisca and Aquila is their name, couple. So he meets this couple in Corinth. So we know from Acts that Paul probably was perhaps in Corinth around 50. We also know from Acts later on that Gallio is the governor over Achaia, which is the area where Corinth is. Cool enough, we have a big stone with Gallio's name on it, and from the dates written on the stone, we can tell that Gallio was governor in Achaia between 51 and 53. If that's true, that means Paul probably was in Acts sometime, or I'm sorry, in Corinth sometime around 50. So we hang this around, we hang these dates around these issues. And then, so we know Paul must have been in Rome or in Corinth sometime around 50, 51. The Aratus mention, we know from dating that he was king between 9 and 39. So that helps us at least know the beginning of Paul's life was sometime around these dates. Well, I mean, yeah, okay. We can also date that Christ must have died sometime between 30 and 35, and Paul, is mentioned about within a year of Paul engaging the Christian community within a year of Christ's life. So this just is an affirmation that Aratus, who was mentioned in 2 Corinthians 11 about towards the beginning of Paul's ministry, just helps us set Paul's ministry is beginning in the 30s, but it doesn't really give us the precise deadlines We know basically the minority, minimal that we know is that Paul must have been in Corinth sometime around 50. What do we know about Paul? Well, we can reconstruct his life based upon all of these things. Now, one other thing that I just wanted to mention is Paul's theology. Paul was a Pharisee, so we know that he grew up interpreting the Torah, right? Remember, the Pharisees have this oral Torah. He has an experience, and he talks about it in his own letters, and he talks about it in Acts. He has an experience which we call this conversion. That's not the most precise word for it, but basically Paul comes to believe that Jesus is the Messiah. At first, he's persecuting the early church, and he comes to believe that Jesus is indeed the Messiah, and that changes everything, right? So Paul definitely becomes a sort of a theologian at this point. But what kind of a theologian was he? Well, he brings his sensibilities as a trained Pharisee to bear. Pharisees, basically, what they did was they helped people navigate life. They were like our preachers, our pastors. And so they would address the issues and needs. Pharisees were eschatological. They believed in the end times that they were coming. They really took into account the context of their communities. And they believed that God was in control. Right? So Paul believes all of these things. But it's his Christology. It's his believing that Christ is indeed, that Jesus is indeed the Christ, the Messiah, that drives him theologically. And so everything that he answers in terms of the issues that, for example, in 1 Thessalonians he's dealing with, everything that he answers, that he addresses, is out of his experience as someone who is a pastor, a Pharisee who is giving them guidance through his understanding of the Torah and his understanding that Jesus is the Christ. That's how he explains and tells his congregations what to do, how to live. So that's how Paul's engaging, and I think you'll see that as you get into 1 Thessalonians and his other letters. Okay, well, I hope that's enough to get you a little taste of Paul. We don't know a whole lot about his life, but we do have some evidence from, a lot from Acts, if you take it all at face value, and certainly some evidence from Paul's own mouth from his authentic letters. Okay, I hope this was useful to you. Thank you.